We are live.
Good morning, Labor Health Social Services Committee. Welcome to second reading of the budget day. Promises an exciting day for those of you who haven't experienced it before. But first, 4 bills this morning, and Marilyn's going to call the roll.
Good morning, Representative Chadwick.
Here.
Representative Clouston.
Here.
Representative Hornock.
Here.
Representative O'Hearn.
Here.
Representative Penn.
Here.
Representative Trujillo.
Here.
Representative Ward.
Here.
Representative Yen. Chairman Swanitzer.
Here. First up this morning will be House Bill 202, pilot student loan payments. Please welcome Representative Walters to Labor, Health and Social Services, exactly where I'm sure he thought this bill was going to go. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I do believe it's adequate to have this bill in this committee, as commercial transport pilots are quite healthy in the fact that they do are required to have a health physical 2 times a year, every 6 months, to maintain their certification. So I do believe that's probably why this bill ended up here. But Mr. Chairman, as an overview, the airline industry as a whole is really struggling to find pilots. And as any of you have flown in recent months or in the last year, all the delays and everything that we're seeing, a large part of that is coming because of the fact that we have a limited number of pilots to man the aircraft. And so they're flying right up against their maximum allowable hours. And so Wyoming, as we are aware, is a very small state, low population, large landmass, but low population. And so as we want to try and ensure we have good air service in the state of Wyoming, I think it's prudent for us to prove to the airline industry that we're willing to try and help alleviate and solve the airline pilot shortage. So that's what this bill attempts to do. It's largely mirrored after a nursing program we have here in the state of Wyoming that allows you to serve as a nurse, get a loan from the state, and then come back to the state and work and the state will pay off the loans for you. If you don't come back to the state, you have to pay off the loans. So that's kind of how globally speaking, that's how this bill is structured. So we'll get right to the bill, Mr. Chairman. Really starts on page 2. As we discuss the Wyoming Airline Pilot Loan Repayment Program, and that you have to be a resident of Wyoming or have a primary residence in Wyoming, or you have to be a graduate from a Wyoming high school to get into the program. And then I'll let you read on through the bottom of page 2. I'm just going to hit the high points here. If you get over to page 3 in subsection D, it discusses how this will be the last money in, essentially. So you'll be expected to go out and look for Pell Grants and other funding that's available for this kind of an education. Then in subsection E, because we cannot dictate, we the state of Wyoming cannot dictate airline scheduling, we simply say that you have to work for an airline that flies regularly into Wyoming. So it would be an overall benefit to the state of Wyoming if that airline continues servicing the state of Wyoming. But you in particular, the student that receives this money, may not actually be the pilot flying into Wyoming, but as long as you're on a route somewhere in their system, it means there's a pilot available to bring a plane into Wyoming. So that's how we had to modify that a little bit. So working for an airline that regularly flies into Wyoming for it, and you have to work for one of those types of airlines for a minimum of 3 years for this loan to be repaid. And then, Mr. Chairman, we move on over to page 4. And it starts to discuss the loan repayment and the reasons that you may be forced to repay it. The first is if you leave the program, you'll have to start repaying it. Makes sense. The second starts on line 9. And I do have an amendment to this section because it just doesn't read very well. But really, if you receive your certificate, is what in Romanet II, if you receive your pilot certificate but fail to get a job within 240 days, or at least one of these types of airlines that are flying regularly into the state of Wyoming, then through rules is how my amendment would read. The Community College Commission would initiate your repayment requirement. And then in Romanet 3, you have 2.5 years from the time that you finish the program at the community college to go ahead and finish getting your pilot certificate, a commercial transport pilot certificate. So really it's just saying we're not going to let you work partway through the program and then just sort of hang out and never really finish things. So, and all of this again is what initiates the forced repayment. I hate to use the word forced, but the required repayment of the loan. And then we move on over to the next page on page 5, and this is where we discuss time in the military and how that will allow for a little bit of a grace period. And then the community brings in Romanet H, the Community College Commission, and how they'll set the interest rates and the terms, the forms and the processes, the criteria. And really, as I said before in the opening, this is formatted after the nursing program. So the Community College Commission is structured, knows how to do this. They have a format in place, and I really I had a lot of assistance from them in crafting this bill because they're already doing this kind of a program for a different industry. And so, Mr. Chairman, the remainder of that on page 6 is what I would call technical jargon, just to make sure that the community college and everything lays it out. And the next major section is in section 2 on page 7, line 6. And here is where we appropriate some money, $1.5 million for these scholarships. And it's for beginning July 1st, 2023 through June 30th, of 2026. So we'll give it a 3-year test, see how it's going, see how many students take advantage of the program. And then we can decide if we want to continue the program. And then it also states that if there's any money that was not spent on this program, it all reverts after that June 30th, 2026 date. And then in section 3, it allows the Community College Commission to begin the rulemaking immediately, followed by July 1st implementation date for an effective date as we would normally have. And that's the bill in a nutshell, Mr. Chairman.
Right.
And if you would allow, I would pass out this amendment to each of you just to show how it can clean things up.
Or you can give them all to us and we'll take care of it. Any questions, for Representative Walters? Not seeing it right now, Tom. Yes, Representative O'Hearn, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What you have $475,000 per year, it looks like. How much is a scholarship do you think is going to cost for each student?
Representative Walters.
But thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that's an unknown number, how much for each student, because it could depend on where they are as they come out of high school, how many college credits they've received towards some of these degrees. So I don't know that I would say there's an average per se. And if they're a year into college already and they choose to start participating in the program. So I think every student's going to be a different amount. And so this was really just a starting point.
Representative Penn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Chairman Walters. You said that there has been a shortage of pilots nationwide. Are we experiencing that in Wyoming? And could you also tell me which airlines we currently have flying into Wyoming?
If you know all that, Representative Walters.
Mr. Chairman, I cannot off the top of my head name all the airlines flying into the state of Wyoming. For example, we have SkyWest flies into Casper for 2 different parent airlines of Delta and United, but they're an independent contractor to each of those airlines. And then over in Jackson, we have American, Alaskan, SkyWest, United, Delta, and I think there's 6 or 7 others, but I don't know them all off the top of my head. I apologize for that. And then as to the airline pilot shortage, yes, it's definitely affecting Wyoming as those airlines, SkyWest and committee, I can use their formal name here, has had to reduce routes due to the inability for them to hire pilots to fly all of their routes. They are the largest in the country regional carrier. And in the last 18 months, I think they've dropped about 40 different communities. Fortunately, Wyoming is not one of them. And in visiting with them, they have many more on their list that may have to be dropped because they just simply do not have the pilots to man the aircraft. They have the aircraft, they are making good money, but if they don't have the people to sit in the front seat, they just can't do it. And that's where I come back to my earlier comment. Wyoming, being a small population, will be affected by it in the future because they'll simply say, we can move this aircraft to a different location, make the same or better money, and we're just, from a business perspective, that's what the decision they will make. By having a program like this in place, it shows Wyoming's dedication to the industry and how important we value air service to the great state of Wyoming.
Other questions right now? Representative Penn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Are there any airlines that you're aware of that are offering scholarship programs or offer payment, loan repayment in these types of programs as the airline itself?
Representative Walters, if you know.
I don't know about the loan repayment side of it. I know that United Airline has set up an entire, what I would describe as college, to try and get students going into the industry. In the last 12 months, they've created that. And then there are some large actual colleges that are airline specific, air industry specific. They are not by any one particular airline, but it's just like going to college, and they would offer the same federal scholarships that you could get if you went to any other college for any other degree, but they're solely focused on the aviation industry.
Yep, Representative Clauston, and then we'll go to Representative Ward.
Hey, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Walters, I know we are seeing less flights into Wyoming. I can tell you where I live, we've lost several flights a week, right? And then costs have gone up because there's less options. My just two thoughts here, you've addressed a little bit. Any talk with airlines on like a matching grant for this scholarship? And then also, I attended the University of North Dakota. Two of my roommates went through the airline program. Just thinking of maybe spots where Wyoming could reserve certain spots or help. What they do for physical therapy is if you attend physical therapy school there, Wyoming pays the difference between in-state and out-of-state tuition. So just another thought there is maybe some other scholarship options.
Any other thoughts there, Representative Walters?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In terms of the aviation program at North Dakota, I don't believe it's slotted. I believe it's just like signing up for any other school and you just go take the classes. So I don't know that we could prepay for any slots in a program necessarily up there or anywhere else for that matter. And as to the other side of the question, I just don't know that I have a great answer for that. So I think I'll.
Representative Ward.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Chairman Walters. Have you considered the possibility that the shortage of pilots is due to vaccine mandates?
Representative Walters, has that thought ever crossed your mind?
Mr. Chairman, I can say that the slowdown in 2020 created a situation where many folks that were on the edge of retirement have chose to retire and not came back into the industry, which has created a little bit of a vacuum effect. But beyond that, there was prior to 2020, there was already a decreasing enrollment versus retirement of pilots entering the aviation world. So this was an issue pre-2020 that 2020 and the years since then have just put a magnifying glass on and really accelerated the problem.
Other question, more Representative Angelos, I know I promised you 15 minutes. It might just not happen though. Representative Penn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Do you know if currently the FAA has a requirement for vaccination for pilots?
Representative Walters.
I'm unaware. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm unaware.
Representative Hornock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this applies to somebody who's going to a flight school at a community college in Wyoming. Do we have such an animal?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have a few community colleges offering these types of programs. The other part of it is there is the ability to do some remote type education in the aviation field, but also many of these commercial transport pilots require have other educational requirements that these students could pick up at the community college before moving into a specialized aviation program elsewhere. And so it would allow them to get a head start on that.
Mr. Chairman.
Yep.
Yeah, so so as long as they're connected to a Wyoming college, I mean, I was aware of some flight schools, but not necessarily connected to a Wyoming community college. So does that limit who we're targeting here?
Mr. Chairman, I don't believe it does. I know Casper College, for example, has an actual aviation program.
Okay.
I believe, I want to say LCCC has portions of an aviation program. and possibly Powell. I don't remember all the community colleges, but there are a few in the state that have at least a full aviation program or a portion thereof. And the other component of this is not just pilots, but it's aviation related. And if they get into a mechanics type program and can become an airline mechanic through one of our community colleges, that also would apply in this type of a situation, or could. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Hey, Representative Hornock, another question?
Yeah, so you go through the program and they're required to keep their residency. Is there a situation where these, because we don't have, they'd have to live in the city, it helps to live in a city where they, where the airline's based out of, so they can fly with that airline. We don't always have the transport down to wherever the hub is. So you're saying with this bill that we could have a student that goes through the program that lives in Atlanta and but keeps their Wyoming residency, or is that a scenario that we would be then paying off their student loan while they're living in another state, working for an airline that just happens to fly in the state, into the state of Wyoming?
Representative Walter.
Mr. Chairman, actually, that's not accurate. When applying, they have to be a resident of the state of Wyoming or a graduate of a Wyoming high school for the application and to be eligible for the program. Then once they have graduated, where they reside is up to them. The repayment requirement is that they must fly for an airline that flies, the airline flies regularly into the state of Wyoming. And again, that comes back to the fact that the Wyoming legislature in the state of Wyoming cannot dictate a company's scheduling of their pilots. So a pilot may be sent from Atlanta in your description up the eastern seaboard to a community. But if that same company flies regularly into Wyoming, they've put a pilot somewhere that opens up a pilot availability to come to Wyoming. And so because we can't get into the business of dictating those schedules, this is the best I could come up with on how we would make sure where they reside once they have received that certificate is not contemplated in this bill. It is simply to apply, they must be a resident.
Off the hot seat. If you need to go, I understand. If not, hang out and we'll hopefully get through quick. Mr. Swank, you here for this?
Thank you. Thank
Thank
you,
you,
committee, and
Representative
thank you,
Walters.
Chairman. I hope you'll consider it favorably.
Any other state agencies here for pilots? I'm not seeing any. Welcome to Labor, Health and Social Services, Mr. Swank. It's amazing. We're both here right now. Those of you not familiar with Michael, he worked for LSO for 18 years and was the mastermind behind the computer process of redistricting before we totally burned him out and he moved on to greener pastures. But welcome, Mr. Swank from the Community College Commission. Thoughts?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not sure I'd call mastermind. That's a little bit too much responsibility. Mr. Chairman, Michael Swank, Chief Financial Officer with Wyoming Community College Commission. We did review this bill prior to it being filed. This bill is structured similar to other student financial aid programs that are administered by the commission. The main one that this one is modeled off of is the Wyoming Investment in Nursing Program, which has been around for almost 20 years. We work with the colleges. The commission only has 12 staff, so we can't actually do all the financial aid packaging and all that sort of stuff. So we rely on all the colleges' financial aid offices to work, or in the colleges for admissions, registrations, and financial aid packaging. And we get certifications from each college on when those students qualify for different programs, whether it's nursing. We did administer a couple of teacher loan repayment programs that have since sunset, as well as Wyoming Works and the Veterans Tuition Benefit Program. All of those rely on our collaboration with the colleges to implement those programs. This is what we would envision to be similar to the Wyoming Investment Nursing Program. Currently, we have two colleges that have aviation-focused programs. One is at Casper College. The other one is at Northwest in Powell. Both colleges have aviation technology, that sort of structure, but they also have a third party go through and do flight training. That is with respect to Representative O'Hearn's question, the tuition and fees at a college would not be the main issue with the cost for this program. It would be flight training fees. Those are much higher than the tuition and fees for a semester. But that would also incentivize students to pursue this career that is, at least initially, a quite expensive endeavor to get that flight training. I believe one of the colleges has a requirement that you get flight hours at least 3 times a week. Each one of those training sessions costs a bit of money. So that's in terms of the cost perspective. We don't know the entire demand for this program. We obviously haven't worked through this program before. I believe each of those colleges has roughly 20 to 30 students apply for those programs each year for whatever semester term that they have. So that's generally the background that we have, that we understand currently from this bill. In terms of the fiscal note, the fiscal note is basically a 95% cost for students and then a 5% administrative fee that we work with a financial aid loan administrator to manage all these loans for us. Obviously, we have a small staff, so we can't do all that for all these programs. So we have a contract administrator that works specifically with the colleges to ensure that truth in lending requirements are met and that sort of thing. So that's how the fiscal note is structured. We would expect roughly 5% to go to that contractor. In terms of the content of the bill, I think it is fairly straightforward. If this were to pass, consistent with all the other programs that we administer, we would have a work group to formulate the rules. It would include the colleges, industry, that sort of thing. It's what we've kind of done for all the programs we've administered, like Wyoming Works, Wyoming's Tomorrow, which is also another program that we will be likely administering in the near future once that is fully funded. So that's kind of the background I have. I'm here to answer any other further questions that you have.
Questions for the commission? You can implement it if we do it. Is
Correct.
okay.
And I will say this was one of my primary committees I staffed for about 6 years, so I'm glad to be back.
Representative Hornock.
Thanks. Do you have an idea of what the average cost is for a student to go through their private pilot, their ATP, clear up through the commercial pilot's license? Kind of on average with some of the other schools that you contract with, do you know what the cost is for that?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Hornock, I do not know anything beyond what the colleges currently provide. So the most likely the tuition and fees costs will be roughly about $1,800 per semester if they take, say, 15 credit hours per semester. The pilot training fees, those can be much higher. My understanding is they can be anywhere from between $10,000 and $25,000 for the length of that program. So that would be 4 semesters at a college, that sort of thing. So it's the flight training fees that are the larger portion of this particular program. In terms of what they would have to pursue or what certifications and training they would have to pursue after they graduate from college, that I'm not familiar with.
Thank you much. Anyone else here in person on this bill? If not, we'll go to Mr. You are Mr. Winnie, come on forward. Mr. Brubaker online. Give you a couple of minutes to jump on in here and tell me how airport operators feel.
Good morning, Chairman Drones, or Bill Winnie, Sublette County.
Go ahead, Mr. Winnie.
I'm a commercial pilot and certificated flight instructor. One of the things you all have focused on, and I think appropriately, is the cost involved. And one of the big things you need to keep in mind, this legislation requires pursuit of an airline transport rating, which is what you really need for flying for the air carriers, for flying people. Some years ago, there was a serious accident around Buffalo, New York, and they attributed part of it to the inexperience of the first officer, which then was only required to be a commercial pilot. The result is now both pilots in the cockpit need to be airline transport rating. A few years ago, there was legislation that sought to pursue an exemption from the FAA for that first officer ATP rating. It didn't end up working out. And that's the biggest single obstacle in my mind to getting what you want for aviation in Wyoming. There are some things that can happen. The biggest thing is 250 hours in a cockpit is what you require for commercial. 1,500 is what you require for a normal ATP rating. And so that gap comes right out of your wallet. which is what you've kind of focused on. There are some ways to get a restricted ATP with fewer hours, like having a bachelor's degree from a aviation college or an associate's degree. I would offer that as you consider what to do with that entry in the, or that part of the legislation about pursuing an ATP rating, recognize those students are going to be trying to build time doing other things. It could be banner towing or pipeline things that don't require carrying passengers for hire, cargo hauling, whatever. So, but they need to be pursuing that, and there's a real cost to that, and you need to at least tuck that in the back of your mind. Subject to your questions, thank you very much.
So general support for the bill, Mr. Winnie? Is that?
I support the bill. Yes, sir. I'm sorry.
No problem. Make sure. Representative Penn, question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question for you. Don't leave this yet. So can you give us are you telling us that the students wouldn't currently graduate from this program we're discussing with an ATP rating, that's something that is obtained afterwards? And can you, if that's the case, can you give us an idea on how long that typically takes? Is there does it take 6 months? Does it take 2 years?
Well, yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. Representative Penn. It kind of depends on how they do it. I pursued my tickets with the FAA through the Air Force Base flying clubs. And so I did it in the cockpit with flight instructors and various books and so on that I could buy. And so that took me a number of years. A guy going to a school, if they have the funds to get up to the commercial license, can probably get there in 6 months to a year. Kind of depends on how much time they can put in the cockpit. There is some amount of time you can put to simulator training, particularly in the instrument rating portion that they would go through. But still, it just takes time in the cockpit. Like I said, 250 hours for commercial rating. After that, they can be going to a school, but the biggest single thing is accumulating those hours requirement to get up to an ATP rating. The restricted ATP ratings, military experience is 750 hours. Aviation bachelor's degree is 1,000 hours. Aviation associate's degree is 1,250 hours. And that gets you the ability to be a first officer in the cockpit of a commercial air carrier carrying people. That issue is carrying people. If they're doing other things like cargo, that's a different thing, and they can work as just a commercial pilot. So it's just building those hours, and they get there, but it takes time. I'm kind of off top of my head, but I would say 1 year to 2 years to get from the commercial 250 hours up to whatever requirement for the airline transport rating.
Okay, further questions?
Thank you. And I have another question. I'm not sure if it's for him or for Representative Walters. So my question is, these programs that we have in Wyoming, are they bachelor's programs or the associates? And then does this bill take into account are we planning on funding those hours after graduation, or are we funding to the point where they graduate, graduate, and then the student would be required to cover the costs to obtain their ATP certification?
I can let Representative Walters answer that and come back in a second if that works. Any other questions for Mr. Winnie? Seeing none. Thank you, Bill. Mr. Brubaker, floor is yours. Welcome, Devin.
Welcome. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, committee members. My name is Devin Brubaker. I serve as the airport director for the Southwest Wyoming Regional Airport and appear before you today representing the Wyoming Airports Coalition. We would first like to express our sincere gratitude to Representative Walters for his leadership in this area. Mr. Chairman, rural airports across this country and right here in Wyoming are in crisis mode. After finally emerging from the extreme reduction in travel during the COVID-19 pandemic, our airports are faced with another macroeconomic problem, a significant labor shortage, specifically a pilot shortage. Across the United States, there have been 68 market exits by legacy air carriers. Nearly every one of those communities impacted is larger than each of our commercial air service communities in Wyoming. In fact, 75% of airports have less air service today than before the pandemic, despite rising passenger demand. This includes airports in Rock Springs, Riverton, Gillette, Sheridan, Casper, Cheyenne, and Cody. Specifically here in Rock Springs, we had returned to pre-pandemic passenger levels at the end of 2021, only to have our capacity cut by 50% in early 2023 due to the pilot shortage. With no end in sight on these capacity reductions and explosive demand growth, it is imperative that leaders across our country and here in Wyoming make bold and innovative decisions to ensure that air service can remain in our rural communities. This pilot shortage is driven by a perfect storm when it comes to the available workforce. A domestic pilot shortage was initially fueled by congressional action, increasing the minimum number of hours needed to be a first officer for an air carrier by 600%. This is coupled with a mandatory retirement age of 65 and a growing number of aircraft needing pilots in all global aviation sectors. House Bill 202 would put Wyoming in the driver's seat of once again leading the country in innovative air service development initiatives. While we understand Wyoming alone cannot solve the industry-wide problems, this legislation can be an important piece of the puzzle. Wyoming has demonstrated for years that it values air service in our rural communities, and it has made the necessary investments to ensure that we are still able to have air service when many of our peers around the country do not. We respectfully ask that this committee move this bill forward and continue to follow in the visionary footsteps of those that sat in the seats before in those seats before you. Thank you for your favorable consideration and your time this morning. And once again, Representative Walters and the other sponsors on this bill, thank you for their leadership. And Mr. Chairman, there were several questions answered that I have answers for. If it's all right with you from committee members, I'd love to answer those if I can.
If you heard them, yeah, please.
Okay, absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So for Representative Ward and Representative Penn's questions regarding vaccine mandates, United Airlines was the only airline to issue a vaccine mandate, which has since been rescinded in the United States. Of their 67,000 employees, 96% elected to not follow this, or elected to follow the requirement. Of the remaining 4%, 2,200 of them were granted exemptions, with only 200 or 0.3% that lost their jobs. Of those 200, less than 20 were pilots. Representative Penn, you asked about the FAA. The FAA does not have any vaccine mandates for pilots or airlines, and there are currently no vaccine mandates in the U.S. airline industry. Representative Hornock, you asked about the cost to obtain an airline transport pilot license. The average cost is around $92,000. And Representative Penn, you asked about how long it takes to achieve an ATP from zero experience up to your ATP. And in an accelerated training program, that takes 2 years on average. Mr. Chairman, once again, thank you for your time. Committee members, happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Mr. Brubaker. Any questions for the airport operators? Seeing none. Appreciate you being here, Devin. Mr. Emerson, welcome to Labor, Health, and Social Services. Floor is yours.
Good morning, and thank you for the time, Mr. Chairman. My name is Todd Emerson. I work for SkyWest Airlines, and we are the largest regional carrier in the country and do a significant amount of air service into Wyoming. We currently serve 9 markets: Gillette, Sheridan, Casper, Laramie, Rock Springs, Jackson, Cheyenne, Riverton, and Cody. And as Mr. Brubaker noted, there have been some reduction in service because we simply lack the pilots to meet the demand. It isn't a matter of that these markets aren't profitable or that we aren't making money. We just don't have the pilots to serve all these different communities as much as they would like to be served. They're still open, but instead of 2 flights a day or 3 flights a day, they'll lose, a flight or 2 for frequency, dropping back the amount and of service that these communities have. Over 68% of Wyoming is served by regional carriers. And we absolutely love doing it. This is a great idea, this program. And to answer one of the questions raised by a representative prior, SkyWest does have a similar loan program through 3 flight schools that we offer to students there, that if we will fund their education, and then if they come to SkyWest and work for a certain amount of time, that loan will be forgiven. But we can't finance it all. And there's a certain amount of money that we can put into that program, but we have found it to be successful, and a lot of pilots will go that route, and then they'll be able to finance their education. And then through sweat equity or the amount of time that they put in here at SkyWest, that loan is forgiven. SkyWest doesn't have and never did have a vaccine mandate. We didn't lose any pilots because of that, but I think some were lost throughout the industry, certainly during COVID. And the regionals are the hiring ground for the majors, because this is where a pilot starts with the regional airlines as a 121 carrier, and for flying people with 1,500 hours or so, then they can start at SkyWest, and then as they build time and hours, they may move on to the majors. But as cargo really grew during COVID, and the majors shrunk during COVID and laid off or found a way to encourage their pilots into early retirement, and then those that just hit age 65, the Vietnam era pilots that disappeared, the industry is in crisis. And we're hiring as fast as we can, but we lose pilots as they attrit to the majors even faster. And pilots are very hard to come by. They're hard to train, and the bar to entry into the field is very high for a number of regulatory reasons that you've already heard about. And it can be very expensive and time consuming. And so these programs really do help people get into a career and a field that's a high paying job that's very good for them and for their families, and also for the state of Wyoming, as it encourages that air service. And we don't have a hub in Wyoming, but we do in Denver and in Salt Lake. And so that's where your air service generally goes, into those two cities, and then from there to Paris or Amsterdam or anywhere in the world. So that's what regional service does for Wyoming, for its industries, for mining, for coal, for gas, oil, tourism. You're 2 flights away from Wyoming if you've got regional service like you enjoy now. And so SkyWest is a strong advocate of this bill, and has used similar programs to great success, and believe that Wyoming itself will benefit. We have hundreds of employees in Wyoming, even though we don't have a hub there. That's where they choose to live and raise their families. It's where they pay their taxes and buy their groceries. And then they commute to Salt Lake or Denver to fly their trips. But we have hundreds of pilots in Salt Lake and Denver, thousands total, and they do a great deal of flying in and out of Wyoming to support your various industries.
May see if there's any questions for you, Mr. Emerson, if that's okay.
Go right ahead.
Not seeing any, and we're on kind of a quick timeline today, so appreciate you being here, and all SkyWest does for Wyoming.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Have a great morning. Anyone else here to testify on this bill? Great, seeing none. Bill is moved by Representative O'Hearn, seconded by Representative Chadwick. Amendments or discussion committee, Representative Yin. Representative Walters, if you want to join us up front, just in case we have questions for you. Go ahead, Representative Yin.
Mr. Chairman, I move the proposed amendment that Representative Walters handed out.
Second.
Okay, and that's moved and seconded. You got that, Marilyn? Okay, and this is on the letting the community college do the rules and regs and not having in statute the official language. Okay, and discussion on that amendment.
Question.
Seeing none, question amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed say no. All right, back in the bill, Representative Walters, I know Representative Penn did have a question earlier. Not sure if you wanted to.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Briefly
On
mention
page
it.
2, to answer the good representative's question, it discusses that what it takes to qualify for the applicant. And it is for the purpose of receiving an aviation or related degree and a commercial or pilot's license, with the intent of obtaining a airline transport pilot certificate. And so what that would mean is, through the 2 programs that are existing in Wyoming, you can get a commercial pilot's license. It's really a number of hours and a written test and a skills test flying the aircraft to meet that requirement for a commercial pilot. But then you have to go on to become an airline transport pilot, and you would just have to show the intent. These costs, as it then is discussed over on page 3, is for the tuition fees and for the costs of earning that commercial pilot certificate. So all of it is to be done here in Wyoming at the community college level.
Question, Representative Penn?
And so are these programs in Wyoming, are they associates or bachelor's programs? I just noticed that there was a difference in hours and what it takes to obtain the ATP, depending on which level of degree they end up with.
Representative Walters, I'm guessing associates if they're at the Community College Commission.
The actual certificate, I think, would be considered more of an associate's because it's a certificate, it's a license. But the associated degree a person might earn while completing that, I would suspect could be either a associate's or upper level. If they went on to get a business degree while doing this, I think through the Community College Commission and the availability, there is a bachelor's and associate's options in those kind of situations. So I think that I can't say that there would be one particular way or the other.
Okay, further amendments or discussion, Representative Ward, and then we'll go to Representative Clouston.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think a lot of industries are reaping the benefits, or shall I say the downside of what they did in the beginning of the pandemic, and that was requiring vaccination. Maybe it's not required now, but it was at the beginning. So you're reaping the rewards of what was done in the industry. An airline with a capital letter that begins with the capital letter U, who received exemptions, when those exemptions were granted, they put those people on unpaid leave. So they could say, well, we didn't fire them. We just put them on unpaid leave. To say that this does not impact or has not impacted the airline industry is ridiculous. That is one reason I'm against this bill. And secondly, it's not the role of government to subsidize Wyoming airports, which is already heavily subsidized. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Clouston.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a point of discussion. I guess I'd feel better about this if we knew what the scholarships would look like. It's up to $20,000 per student or up to $10,000. Either that or, you know, I hate providing somebody a free education if maybe they can afford it. I might feel better about a no interest loan, something along those lines. In general, I'm in support of this. Our industries need to have airline services if we're going to grow Wyoming. But maybe as we move it to the floor, there could be some other considerations.
I feel like if the bill passes, there might be an amendment coming, Representative Walters. Other discussion on the bill, Representative Hornock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So being a pilot, I actually look at this like somebody's handing me the keys to a Ferrari. This is tempting just because of that aspect. However, there's some things that I really can't swallow about it. I don't think if we do this for every industry that is struggling with employees with shortage in the workforce, I think there's no limit to what we're going to look at. And so, you know, when I got my pilot's license, I had to grunt and grind and work and claw for what I did. And that enabled me to be where I am today. And it kind of developed some things in my character that I think were good that I would have missed out. Another thing I don't really like about this is we have a kid who graduates from a Wyoming high school. He goes into this program, and then you know, it's a little bit different than the nursing stuff that we have, because the nurses have to work here within the borders of our state, and dentists and other things, they have to work within the borders of our state. We're allowing, and granted, there's some difficulties with the airlines. The airlines is you know, they fly all over. We don't really have a hub here, but you know, we're allowing these kids, once they get to a certain point, to really live anywhere, as long as they maintain the residency, which I don't really, I think we're going a little bit far on that, but anyway, you know, it's tempting, but like I said, it's the government handing somebody the keys to a Ferrari, and I just think we're going a little bit overboard with that. So thanks.
Okay, I'm just guessing most airplanes cost more than Ferraris, but check on that for me. Any other discussion before the vote? Representative Penn.
So I love the idea of scholarships. I love the idea of United Airlines having their college, their school, and SkyWest doing their loan repayment programs. I think we should continue that. I think as soon as we start involving government, we are creating an unfair competition with the private market, and this is where that should be had, and therefore I would urge a no vote.
Okay, with that question being called, Marilyn, if you'd call the roll on House Bill 202.
Glad to do that. Representative Chadwick.
Aye.
Representative Klauston.
Aye.
Representative Hornock.
No.
Representative O'Hearn.
Aye.
Representative Penn.
No.
Representative Trujillo.
Aye.
Representative Ward.
No.
Representative Yin.
Aye.
Chairman Swanitzer.
Aye. Thank you for being here today, Representative Walters. Good luck with it on the floor.
Thank you, committee. I appreciate your time today.
Next up, Representative Angelos. I know we've had a couple of delays, but we're happy to finally see you here in Labor, Health and Social Services. We're doing House Bill 127, the Healthcare Facilities and Clergy. Please welcome Representative Angelos. Floor is yours.
Good morning, Chairman Zwanitzer and members of the committee. Thank you for allowing me to be here. I bring to you today House Bill 127, and I look for your favorable consideration. This bill, House Bill 127, would establish our clergy or leaders of faith as essential healthcare workers during the event of another health emergency, God forbid. This would create a new statute, 35-2-121, allowing a patient or resident of a medical facility to request an in-person visitation from their clergy member or allow their legally authorized representative to request an in-person visitation if the patient or resident is incapacitated during a health emergency. We saw that during the pandemic. So we did see medical facilities close to in-person visitation out of care and concern of spreading disease. And just talking even with a lot of our medical professionals, we realized that maybe we made some mistakes and we learned some lessons. And so here we're trying to address that. So clergy members, and it's very broad, could be priest, pastor, deacons, a faith leader. This legislation would allow them to visit, showing that we are recognizing Wyoming's First Amendment rights under the U.S. Constitution. And they're underneath the Wyoming Constitution, Article 1, Section 18 says, the free exercise and enjoyment of religious profession and worship without discrimination or preference shall be forever guaranteed in the state. We all know someone who sat alone or sadly died alone in a medical facility across the state without comfort, final prayers, rites read, and we definitely learned something from that. So clergy members usually are the ones who have celebrated every major milestone, baptisms, dedications of babies, marriages, maybe marriage counseling, a lot of them. They do our funerals. They sit with us when we have family members that are dying, and they're with us cradle to grave. So not allowing them to come in, we all realize, I think even our medical professionals realized the problems that stemmed from that. This bill will recognize spiritual health as a priority along with physical and mental health. And in a article published in the 2014 Journal of Psychiatry, a number of studies suggested that there was a reduced mortality for populations who frequented attending a religious services compared with those who did not attend. So extending visits from our own faith leaders would help those who are sick or in end-of-life situations. I myself work in ministry and saw a lot of our own people once admitted to a hospital. They were locked away from people. And I think it was heart-wrenching for us as people and for the doctors and medical professionals as well. Nurses, we all saw it. It was hard. We violated our Wyoming citizens' freedom of religion. I know several people, some friends, and some from my own church body that died alone. Actually, a member of our own legislative body's father he was elderly, aging, and was, I'm sorry, it's so hard. He was in his end of life, 96 years old. And his last rites were not able to be read while he was in a medical facility. So his family pulled him out and had his last rites read. I'm going to get it together. I do want to thank the Wyoming Hospital Association. They helped collaborate on this bill, and I do appreciate that. One thing I want to make sure is that we do recognize that the medical facilities can ask clergy members to follow CDC guidelines such as PPE or wearing masks. We definitely don't want to be reckless. We don't want to spread disease, especially if somebody is sick. I can guarantee you, knowing several clergy members, they will gladly put on stuff, PPE, gowns, to keep from getting sick themselves, from spreading it to others, specifically in our nursing homes. That would be very important. And I have a dad that's a pastor. He definitely wants to stay healthy. So we do recognize that, and we worked on that with the Wyoming Hospital Association as well. So with that, I will go through the bill.
Okay.
Any questions?
I don't think there's any questions yet.
Okay.
I mean, the bill's fairly easy, so you can go
It
through it
is.
cursory. Yeah.
Yeah, so page 1, line 1s through 4 is just the definition of the bill. Just recognizing clergy members as essential healthcare workers. Line 8 through 10 just describes the statute that will be created. Page 2, line 1 through 3 defines what a clergy member is. So we definitely don't want to ostracize any religious denomination or sect, rabbi, priest, minister, any lay religious counselor as well. So lines 5 through 7, healthcare facility that's described under statute, Wyoming statute 35-2-901. Line 8 describes what a public health care emergency is, or a public health emergency. And lines 11 through 15 just describes that a medical facility cannot prohibit either a patient or resident from asking for a visitation. Line 18 through 23 just describes the patient or resident or a patient's resident legally authorized representative, including a family member if they're incapacitated. Page 3 is just a description and definitions on healthcare facilities, what they may impose for, along with the CDC, Medicaid, Medicare services, and describes that in statute 35-1-220. And then goes on to just say that they cannot prohibit a clergy member from visiting. And with that, I stand for questions.
Questions for Representative Angelos? Representative Hornock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So prior to the pandemic, explain what could happen in the hospital and what the usual standards or, what was happening with clergy.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Hornock, before then, you could, if a patient requested, you could go in. If it was an infectious disease, I don't know if you've ever dealt with like C. diff. Clergy members were definitely going to gown up, but they could go in and pray, visit, counsel, read scripture. That was definitely something that was allowed. With the pandemic, we saw, everybody locked out. So.
Okay, further questions? Seeing none right now. Anyone, agencies here on this bill? Jackie? Organizations, Hospital Association, you were called out. Come on down. Sounds like you actually got a shout out, Mr. Boley, but welcome to Labor, Health, Social Services.
Chairman Zwanitzer, committee members. That doesn't happen very often for me. As Representative Angelos shared, we've worked collaboratively on this. We started working on it. I think the first we heard of this bill was in October. Senator Kinski kind of teed it up, and then over the last couple of months, Representative Angelos and I've really worked to narrow this down and to make it a good bill. I think one clarification though, if it's all right, this does not create a new essential healthcare worker. It allows clergy to come in, but we actually looked at doing that. And as an essential healthcare worker, they would have fallen under the CMS and CDC requirements for vaccines and all of that. Obviously, we are supportive of any type of visitation within reason. And normally, like Representative Angelo shared, up until the pandemic hit, there were very few times where visitation was limited in any of our healthcare facilities. We've learned a great deal during the pandemic. Hopefully, CMS and CDC have learned a great deal as well. This has been a situation over the last 3 years that we hope we never would face. And I think we've learned a lot. The thing that I would tell you is the decisions to limit visitation and to lock down our facilities were not ours. And as an association president for both the Wyoming Hospital Association and Leading Age Wyoming, we have pushed back as far as we can against CMS. We have had multiple calls. We've talked with our licensing agency we meet every single Friday, and our members have talked about how we could do this. We found creative ways to allow visitation. With respects to this bill, we think it's important. And I don't know how much I really care to share with this committee about my personal life, but I do have some examples. I have an ecclesiastical calling as well. And over the last 3 years, I've been denied access to some of the members of my congregation early on. I've been in the ICU several times to minister to people. I wore full PPE in both of those occasions. As restrictions were lifted, I had to wear a mask, and I was good to do whatever was necessary to get in to see those folks. I didn't push back or fight. I was with a person and her family as she took her last breaths this summer. And as early or as late as New Year's Eve, I was in one of our nursing homes and was with a lady that I left after she fell asleep, and she passed away just before the new year was ushered in. And we conducted her funeral while we've been here in session. So I think this is an important bill. We don't want to restrict visitation in most situations in any of our healthcare facilities. There are certain times, and there's a bill that's coming through the Senate that has to do with visitation for everyone, where there are times that we have to limit visitation, and it has nothing to do with pandemic or disease. It has to do with situations in people's lives and what's happening for their safety. So with that said, I'd answer any questions, but we are in favor of this bill, and we're happy to see it advance.
Question for the Hospital Association. Seeing none. Thank you for being here. Other people in the room on this bill, Mr. Winters and Mr. Winnie, come on down. Anybody else here to testify can come up to the front at this point as well. I just want to call you representative every time I see you, Nathan, but Mr. Winters, welcome.
It's good to see you too, Mr. Chairman. My name is Nathan Winters, president of the Wyoming Family Alliance. I'm here in support of House Bill 127. And 2 years ago, I performed the funeral for a dear elderly gentleman who had been an eminent pastor in this town many years ago. By the way, after he retired, he traveled across the world and wound up speaking to several parliamentary bodies and to vast stadiums of people many times. Most here didn't know about that until after he had passed. He was a very deep and humble man of faith. But sadly, at the end of his life, he passed without the ability for anyone to visit with him because of the severity of the restrictions that had been placed upon us. What we endured a couple of years ago was very instructive because we really had never faced this kind of scenario. As a result, scholars have reminded the faith community of our historic roles during the time of plague and sickness. In a letter that is nearly 500 years old at this point, entitled "Whether One May Flee from a Deadly Plague," Martin Luther recommended that one take precautions when entering into a potentially deadly situation, but never to run from them. Furthermore, Mr. Luther had been ordered to leave the University of Wittenberg, where he taught, but he refused. Instead, he and his wife, Katerina von Bora, formerly a nun with a lot of nursing skills, wound up opening their home to many people to help during that time. I can tell you from multiple times where over the last 20 years of my life, I've had the sometimes sad responsibility, but humble privilege of being with a number of people at the last moment of their life. And it never leaves you unchanged. But I will say that it is something that's very important for each of those individuals. And so I really appreciate the thoughtfulness of this particular bill. Just 2 days ago, early in the morning, I was with a gentleman in our church, and as he was entering into open heart surgery. And I can tell you both from my experience and his that those moments are unique and very, very important. And so I appreciate what this bill is attempting to accomplish, and also what the Hospital Association has tried to do in working with the bringer of this bill. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, and without any other questions, I'm done. I appreciate your time.
Questions for Mr. Winters? Seeing none, Mr. Winnie.
Mr. Chairman, Bill Winnie, Sublette County. I support the bill. I'd like to speak from my perspective, having served as a commanding officer twice in my career in the Navy. Through much of my career, I was stationed on board submarines. We didn't have chaplains or other ecclesiastical people assigned to the ship. They would come down and visit us when we were in home port. But I never had a particular sense that they made a real difference on the submarine, probably because we were so far away from them for most of the time. We'd go to sea for 80, 90, 100 days at a time. We did have lay leaders on board the ship. Later in my career, I was commanding officer of the USS Holland, a large ship with 1,400 size crew. And we had chaplains, 2 of them. And it took me about a year to kind of observe how they interacted with people on the ship. But about a year into that time as CO, I began to have a real sense that they made a difference in the lives of the people on the ship. And I don't know that I could tell you specifically any illustrations or whatever, but I just had this sense, and it was from the personal interaction on a day-to-day, week-to-week kind of basis. I would also offer sometimes in the realm of acting as a CO and what we call captain's mast, Article 15 hearings, where you have to decide something about one of your crew members, not in the religious sense, but in the supporting sense of how do you render a just decision for somebody. I found the chaplains a resource. And again, I'm not talking in the perspective of religion, but I'm talking in the perspective of how do you get to the right kind of answer. So I support the bill because I think these things make a difference. And I don't know that you can necessarily put your finger on it all the time, but you've heard some examples here, subject to your questions. Thank you.
Questions, Mr. Winnie? Seeing none. Thanks, Bill. Mr. Lang, virtually, welcome to Labor, Health, Social Services. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman Zwanitzer, and thank you to Representative Angelos for putting together this bill, collaborating with it. My name is Jonathan Lang. I'm speaking from Evanston, and I appreciate the ability to come in by Zoom. I am a leader of the Wyoming Pastors Network and wanted to address this bill from that perspective. Representative Angelos's heart-wrenching story already, I think, is shared by hundreds of pastors that I know, and I'm one of them. It's very hard to talk about. But it was a little over a year ago that I watched a dear friend and member die alone through a Zoom connection. And the thing that was so heart-wrenching about it is that the last words he ever said to me was, "Pastor, would you fight to make sure that you can get into the room when I die?" And I fought, and the attending doctor wanted me to be there, but it was the hospital policy which would simply not allow it, even if I would sign away all of my liabilities for, getting sick and dying myself. And the doctor even admitted to me that there was no earthly reason why I shouldn't be there, but nevertheless I couldn't. And I know that my friend died without human touch and without the words of the gospel in his ears, muted as it was by the machines trying to compete with the Zoom. So that's my story. And like I say, I'm not alone. It's been repeated across the state, and you know as well as I do. And the testimony of Mr. Bowley helped you with that as well. Maybe just two more things that the committee should consider here. One of them is that in the middle of the pandemic, I was contacted from somebody out of state. It was a distraught son who was simply unable to visit his father in Cheyenne. And because he had read my stuff online, he thought maybe that I'd be able to help. I tried. We went to the ombudsman, the governor's ombudsman, with regard to the nursing homes, and there was no avail. There was nothing that could be done for him to see his father. So this is definitely necessary legislation. And then one last thing to testify. In case the committee believes that this might be in the rearview mirror and not happening anymore, and we're kind of, closing the barn door after the horse is gone, you need to know that last week at the Wyoming State Hospital here in Evanston, I was denied the ability to visit a man in need. And it wasn't because he was sick, and it wasn't because there was any sickness in the pod where he was staying. It was because somewhere on the acre-sized campus, somebody had tested positive for COVID, and all clergy were, their visits were canceled for 2 weeks because of one positive COVID test. It's still happening. And something that's even more ominous is in the email that told me I couldn't visit my member. It was also mentioned that influenza A and influenza B are going around the campus, which makes me wonder at what point this will not be just a COVID concern, but a common cold concern. So I strongly support this legislation on behalf of hundreds of pastors. And again, I thank Representative Angelos for bringing it. I stand for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Pastor Lane. Any questions? Seeing none. Appreciate you being here today. Anyone else testify on this bill? Deacon Lehman. I'm guessing you're in favor, but always enjoy hearing from you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very briefly, I recognize the importance of the challenge that healthcare workers have as a former firefighter, especially in emergent situations, to be able to have some control over scene, but also recognize the critical importance, especially when people are in their final stage of life, to be able to have the comfort of clergy member that they have grown in relationship with, and as they make their final journey on this earth, to have that comfort. So with that, I would stand for any questions.
Questions? Yeah. Seeing none.
Thank you.
All right. Seeing no further comments, we'll close public comment. Committee, what's your pleasure?
I move the bill.
That's the most popular bill we've had. Let's go with moved by Representative Ward for the record and seconded by Representative O'Hearn. You have comments, discussion, amendments. Representative Hornock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to make an amendment. Because of some of the testimony that we have heard, I would like to make an amendment. Section 2, so page 3, line 18, section 2. I would like to make this effective immediately. So I'm not sure the exact language, but this act is effective immediately upon completion of all acts necessary for ability to become laws provided in Article 4, Section 8 of the Wyoming Constitution, something along those lines.
Standard language. If you just Marilyn, if you just put effective immediately, LSO has the standardized language when the governor signs the bill. It goes in. There is a seconded by O'Hearn. Discussion on that amendment. Question being called. All in favor of the amendment to make it effective immediately, say aye. Opposed, say no. That passes. Any other discussion? Representative Yin.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, Representative. I appreciate the bill and I really do appreciate you working with the stakeholders involved to make sure that balance of public safety and making sure no one has to die alone is really in there. My father died of COVID and it really was not a pretty sight. And so I really do appreciate you moving this forward in a way that I think everyone can agree on. So appreciate that.
Representative Warnock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I wish we could rewind the clock and, this was something we were talking about 2 years ago. Obviously it would have been important. It's kind of interesting. Some of the stuff we talk about on this panel, is not really fall within my wheelhouse, but this bill and the last bill do. I'm actually a licensed minister. So one of the things that I did during that time while I was working in that capacity was go to a hospital, and they had a whole day orientation to take clergy through and explain to them what the clergy is allowed to do in those situations. And a couple takeaways from that. One was that I was just amazed at the hospital's openness to allow clergy into various spots into the ICU, into the recovery room right after the patient gets out of surgery. You're able to see that individual. You're able to go directly to their family and report. Oftentimes there's a giant gap between, the families waiting to hear from the doctor. But when there's a clergy present, when there's a minister present, and the family has especially a minister that they trust, they rely on, they know, it's such a relief for that family to make that connection, to bridge the gap in knowing their loved one is on the other side of the wall, not knowing what's going on, and the clergy is able to, to be a part of that for the family. So it's great to see the support for this bill, and thanks for bringing it.
All right, with that, Marilyn, if you call the roll on House Bill 127.
Representative Chadwick. Representative Klauston. Representative Hornock.
Aye.
Representative O'Hearn.
Aye.
Representative Penn.
Aye.
Representative Trujillo.
Aye.
Representative Ward.
Aye.
Representative Yin. Chairman Zwanitzer.
Aye. Got a 9-0 in labor health. I'm impressed. Congratulations, Representative Angelos. Good luck on the floor. With that committee, we're actually going to go to House Bill. As soon as I find it, 261 brought to us by Representative Washut, who can't be here because he's currently chairing the committee next door. So co-sponsored by Representative Chadwick. So Representative Chadwick, if you'd present House Bill 261, breach of the peace within a healthcare facility to the committee. I was even going to give you the allowability of not having to go down there, but since you're already on your way. I am. Welcome, Representative Chadwick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you can see, this is a very simple bill, not very complicated at all. It's I'll just read the statement that I got. This bill creates enhanced penalties for people who violate the existing breach of the peace statute when that breach occurs in a healthcare facility. It's not any more complicated than that. There's just not a whole lot to it. It provides for penalties and a misdemeanor charge should that be violated. And you'll see that in the bill on page 2. There's just not a whole lot here to talk about. It's very straightforward. It's a breach of peace in a healthcare facility where we have talked previously, about breach of peace, I guess you could say. And the individual, this talks about the breach of peace in a facility. And if you have any questions, I'll try to answer them.
And we already have breach of peace in 66102 A and B. This just extended to a healthcare facility. And Representative Washit, this is another one of those things out of the Joint Judiciary Committee when we were talking about violence against any number of workers, that he believed this to be a better option, which may be why he voted against my bill yesterday on third reading. But so it's here today, and he thinks this is a better way to go to cover what the interim Judiciary Committee did. That makes more sense to him. Happy to field questions or Representative Chadwick can. Representative Ward.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Aren't the actions described in this bill already illegal?
Representative Chadwick, you can certainly try to answer that. But I believe the answer is yes.
And that would be my impression. This more than as much as anything provides for enhanced penalties.
Representative Penn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What is the change in penalty? So what is the enhancement? What is the basic breach of peace penalty, and what does this change it to?
Representative Chadwick, if you'd like me to help you out, breach of.
Mr. Chairman, I'll give it a stab.
Okay.
As it mentions in the bill, not less than 1 day, nor more than $750 fine. That's in the bill. What it is right now, I don't know. Okay.
Which I'm on Mike. The current penalty is in 66102B, which is not listed in your bill because we're not amending it. Current breach of the peace is a misdemeanor punishable by imprisonment for not more than 6 months, a fine of not more than $750 or both. So standard basic misdemeanors. This just says you get 1 day in jail, interestingly. Other questions on the bill for Representative Chadwick? Go ahead, Representative Clausen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Representative. Just wondering about other allied health professionals that aren't included on this. So, I'm a physical therapist. I have 30 employees. As I read this, we're not covered, or I might look at, just several other allied health professionals that are not listed. Would you be open to adding those?
Representative Chadwick?
I'm not sure. Excuse me, Chairman, Mr. Chairman, and Representative Clausen. I'm not sure if the sponsor would be. I am. But of course, this specifically addresses the facilities.
Other questions? Let me say there's public comment, and then we can maybe discuss as a committee.
Okay.
Public comment. Wyoming Association of Hospitals, come on down. And Representative Chadwick, you're welcome to come back up here. As you're just co-sponsoring the bill, at your pleasure. Mr. Boley, welcome back.
Mr. Chairman, committee members, Eric Boley with the Wyoming Hospital Association and Leading Age Wyoming. We support this bill. We were pretty sad to see the other bill voted down yesterday on third reading. I'm not sure this really goes as far as that does. I think anything we can do to send a message to our healthcare workers that we actually care about them and that we value their service to the state is a good one. There might be some ways that we could amend this as we look at it. I think we need to look at healthcare facility definition in statute. I'm not sure if that covers Representative Clausen's concerns or not, but we would support anything that adds additional protection for our healthcare workers and lets them know that that we actually care. We stand in support. I'd answer any questions.
Questions for the Hospital Association? Seeing none, thanks. Anyone else here to testify in favor or against this bill? I'm not seeing anyone online either. No. All right, with that, we will close public comment. Committee, what's your pleasure on House Bill 261?
Move the bill.
Moved by O'Hearn, seconded by Chadwick. Any discussion on the bill or amendments, committee? Representative Ward.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Because this is already illegal and I feel that it's trying to curtail some of the First Amendment rights that were expressed during the scamdemic, I will be voting no.
Representative Trujillo.
This is already a law and we tried to pass a bill yesterday. However, I think our nurses know that we support them and we care for them. It seems like it needs to be an internal policy fix rather than a state fix to show that the nurses and staff are cared for.
Other discussion, Representative Penn?
My concern with this is the same concern as I had the bill that was mentioned that we discussed yesterday. And that is special classes. Once you start creating special classes, as we've already seen in this discussion on this bill today, well, how come if they get it, why don't I get it? I think I fall in the same. How are they more special than me? And then we keep on and more special classes. So I would encourage a no vote.
But these are special buildings, like churches or banks. Anyway, Representative Hornock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I've a question on this. We heard a lot of debate in the previous bill dealing with this, and then it went through this committee and then died on third reading, which is not very common. So there was quite a bit of discussion. It seems like we're taking a second stab at the same beast. What's different and why would the result be different if we move this bill forward?
I mean, I think that testimony is correct from my understanding. What's different is there's still, well, what's the same is it's still another misdemeanor that says at least maybe something that says we're not the only state that doesn't have anything on our books. Perhaps what's changed is this was more the pleasure. If you see the co-sponsors, three of those co-sponsored voted against House Bill 149 because they believe this to be a better method and not do a protected class. And why protected building does seem interesting to me. It's existing statute in A and B. And so they're trying to still cover that void that I think we heard about from an economic perspective, certainly, but that void if we don't have anything that at least makes some of our healthcare workers feel protected. So yeah, no, I think it's exactly a second bite of the apple designed to get, and this was introduced, a couple weeks ago, so it wasn't out of nowhere, but it was certainly Chairman Washett's desire from hearing the same testimony the Judiciary Committee heard in interim that he believed this to be a better way of go, but he was nice enough, Chairman courtesy, I suppose, to let me push the bill under my name as the first path forward. He said he didn't want this heard if that bill made it. And then yesterday, when that bill failed, we had a talk and he said, throw mine up as quick as possible. So that's why it's here today. And I don't think I'm trying to disillusion anybody why it's here. That's exactly the reason is kind of a backup bill because the three co-sponsors who voted no yesterday felt this was a better process. Other Representative Penn.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I might just say, if Wyoming is the only state that doesn't have these extra protections, maybe we need to, I think that we should use that as a badge of honor that we are upholding and honoring our Constitution, which creates equal rights for all. And as soon as we start giving special rights to some, we're at the same time taking away rights from others. And Wyoming recognizes our Constitution.
And our Constitution recognizes that about 7 classes of people have equal rights that other people don't. So I appreciate that, but it's an interesting to go back to the Constitution that some classes are protected based on some beliefs or characteristics and others are not. Anyway, in regards to this bill,
Question.
Vote your conscience. Marilyn, if you'd call, unless anybody else had comments. Okay, with that, Marilyn, if you call the roll on House Bill 261.
Representative Chadwick. Representative Klauston. Representative Hornock.
No.
Representative O'Hearn.
Aye.
Representative Penn.
Aye, no, Sorry.
No. Representative Trujillo,
No.
Representative Ward,
No.
Representative Yin gave an absentee vote of aye. Chairman Zwanitzer. The bill passes with 5 ayes and 4 noes.
Representative Chadwick, I know I don't think anyone talked to you about this, but you're about to chair Labor, Health and Social Services. So I have the next bill up. I'm going to go down there and present if you would take over.
Having a heck of a time getting your, these things turned back off. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, I think. Next bill for our consideration, House Bill 263. And here for us today to guide us through this is sponsor of the bill, Chairman of this committee, Dan Zwanitzer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think the speaker threw this bill out to the committee yesterday as knowing I would probably get it heard. So let me give you some background while we have some time on voting rights, because it is a long, complicated subject that has a long history in the Wyoming legislature and all state legislators, quite honestly. So first off, voting is a right reserved to the states under the U.S. Constitution, right? It's not an enumerated powers in Article 1. Section 8. And so every state gets to set their own parameters around voting, subject to a couple of federal laws over the past 100 years, the Voting Rights Act, et cetera. One of the voting rights perspectives that Wyoming and other states still hold is the right to say when you can vote if you've been convicted of a crime. And this goes all the way back to common law in the 1600s about losing your right to participate in government when you've been convicted of a crime. Over the past, let's say 30 years. So know that before 2003, if you committed a felony in Wyoming, violent or nonviolent, you did not get your voting rights back. And I believe 2 states still have that on their books. And that map, I did pass out a map to the committee where every state stands on voting rights. And you'll see the Virginia and Kentucky, I believe, you never get your voting rights back after being convicted of a crime. We have a couple of states, Maine and Vermont, that they actually let you vote while you're incarcerated. They'll bring the county clerks and election officials into the jail and they make sure everybody has a vote. So those are kind of your 2 very broad perspectives on both sides of this issue of when each state kind of allows their citizens to vote. So back in 2003, we did an interesting thing in that session where we as a state had a 5-year window. So we said we don't want to never allow this possibility. So 20 years ago, we said, we'll give you at least a 5-year window. And we started this kind of bifurcation between violent felonies and non-violent felonies. And we went through the statutes and said, these 7 crimes, we consider these violent felonies, murder, rape, first-degree sexual assault. You never get your voting rights back. But we did say after 5 years and a non-violent one-time occurrence or multiple misdemeanor charges or nonviolent felony charges in the same occurrence, you could still petition. We did in 2017, I believe. Sometimes I get my years mixed up, so they'll correct me if I'm wrong. But here about 5 years ago, we did go back and say nonviolent felons could get their voting rights restored automatically upon completion of their sentences, restitution fines, et cetera, immediately, and they could be granted a certificate by the department. It was a really difficult conversation because, as you'll hear, I think, from the department, you can't just kind of wave a wand at all of these people are now in the system. The department actually had to go back into their system one by one over 2 or 3 years, find all the people who had nonviolent crimes and restored this back to 2010. So you see that weird language in the bill that says after 2010, because we had them in the system. I think it took a couple of years to be able to allow those voting rights back and give those restoration certificates. Now, in the past 5 years, I think many states have gone to this new kind of allowance that as soon as you're done with all of your restitution, fines, probation, parole, you're automatically getting your rights back. And I think you've heard of this, probably Florida was a big example a couple of years ago. They re-enfranchised 3 million people. What I originally attempted to do with this bill was to, so it's coming to you a little bit late because it's gone through a couple of iterations. And we are going to go back and allow all non-felons or all felons who were committed of non-violent felonies to get their voting rights back. The department behind me, I'm certainly not blaming them, but was nice enough to give me a fiscal note of $3 million in 21 new positions to make that happen, because they were going to have to go back through all these individual records, find people who've moved, et cetera. And nobody wants a $3 million, 21 new position fiscal note. So what this bill attempts to do is still keep that violent versus non-violent felony bifurcation, but basically says at the very end of the bill, even if you don't get that certificate from the department that your voting rights have been restored, you automatically get it for not having committed a violent felony. And let me tell you why this is really important in the new world we're operating in. What we've been seeing increasingly, and we had 2 here in my county in the last election cycle, when you move here from another state, you still fall under our state voting rights act. So you could have committed a violent felony in another state and be allowed to vote there. But if you move to Wyoming under our law, you having that felony conviction somewhere else, what we would consider a violent felony, you're not allowed to vote here. And we'd like to make sure everybody knows that, but sometimes people still fall through the, I didn't know I couldn't vote here. Likewise, if you're a violent felon here and you move to another state, you are allowed to vote there. So many states, as you'll see on this map I passed out, this orange color or even the blue color, there's always kind of been this, if you fulfill your probation and other requirements, you can vote, or as soon as you're not incarcerated, you can vote. So you can kind of see all states are all over the map. What I'm really attempting to do is bring us more in line with those orange states, except I'm trying to keep this still the violent felony, those 7 crimes, you don't get your voting rights back. I still think that's too far of a step. Sometimes I even wonder if this bill is still a little bit too far of a step for the body as a whole right now, but I think this is a way that it is administratively appropriate and can be managed. So I hope I didn't go too much into weeds, but what at the heart does is as soon as you have, if you're a felon, you got convicted of a felony and you have served your time, paid your restitution, that will allow your voting rights back. And I think historically, when I started this 20 years ago and started in the legislature, there was this fear that maybe one political party, a lot of the people who had felonies joined that party, and there was some trepidation on feeling comfortable. I think from all the charges and convictions we've seen in Wyoming the past 3 election cycles, they've almost been on the other political party's side. And so I don't think it's a partisan issue as much as it got charged up to be 20 years ago with what political party ex-felons are registering for. And I just think it's time that we keep getting people caught in this, sometimes unbeknownst to them, void where if they're moving from state to state, their rights to vote are different. And so I'm really just trying to say, hey, if it's a nonviolent felony from another state and you don't know the law here, we're not going to charge you with a crime, because voting when you're not allowed to is a felony in Wyoming. It's a pretty serious charge. We take voting very seriously here. And so sometimes people have fallen in the, I didn't know. And we did have a case 4 years ago in Park County where somebody, a semi-public figure admitted on a public broadcast that he had actually had a felony in another state, and he voted, and people who didn't like him came after him, and he got charged with a felony for kind of admitting this as part of an interview he did, and he got caught in that trap. And so what I'm really trying to do is make sure we have about 7 to 10 people, I think, every election cycle commit felony voter fraud, honestly, because arguably they don't know the law and their rights. So this is one more step to try to say, we want to reintegrate you in society. And you've served your time, you served your sentence, you now get your privileges back. So happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Any questions? Representative O'Hearn.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Mr. Chairman, I guess I'm a little confused. Are we all orange right now? And we want to be orange and yellow? Or we are orange and yellow now and we want to stay that way? Thank you.
So, Mr. Chairman, Representative Ahern, I believe we are the 5th most restrictive state in the country, and we would still, even under this law passage, either be 5th or 6th most restrictive. So I would love to get to orange, but that would require this legislature to say, even with a violent felony, you serve your time, you get your rights back. I mean, that's where the legislature wanted to go. I think I'd be okay with that, but sensing kind of the will of the body, I'm thinking this might be the next step to undertake. And I should mention, Mr. Chairman, right now the law says a nonviolent felony or nonviolent felonies committed in the same charging, basically the same act. This would say if you have more than one nonviolent felony, so you had 2 drug arrests within a year, 10 years ago, you'd be able to get your voting rights back as well. So we also have that catch on a one instance thing. This would broaden that to say you could have more than one nonviolent felony and get your rights restored.
Follow up, Mr. O'Hearn. Anyone else? Mr. Representative Hornock. We'll get you next.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. So why in the bill would we repeal 713-105B? So 713-105B talks about the restoration of voting rights. It requires the Department of Corrections to issue a certificate, and then there's qualifications. One of the qualifications is that they haven't completed another or been convicted of another felony during that time. And then they have completed their sentence, they've completed probation, parole. So it seems like that puts our safeguards in place and allows these nonviolent felony offenders to have their voting rights restored. But in this law, we're kind of repealing that section and then opening it up without necessarily what we like to say sideboards or the qualifications for that. So can you explain that portion being repealed?
Go ahead, Mr.
Sure,
Chairman.
Chairman Chadwick, Representative Hornock, and it is what I just mentioned. It's on that last part of B, the nonviolent felonies arising out of the same occurrence or related course of events. And so we've added that the first 3 sentences elsewhere in the bill, but the repealer is what takes out the single nonviolent felony or the same occurrence of events. So you could arguably have 3 nonviolent felonies now over 5 years and still get your voting rights restored if it didn't fall into one of those 7 violent categories.
Representative Ward.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman and Chairman Swanitzer. My question concerns nonviolent crimes. So I noticed that nonviolent crimes include embezzlement, bribery, white collar crimes. For example, that could be committed maybe by members of a legislature. So I'm wondering the justice of allowing, say, someone committed a crime by embezzling a whole lot of taxpayer money while they were a public servant. I'm wondering the wisdom of allowing a person like that to get their voting rights back. And I'm wondering if you might consider some amendments to address that.
Chairman Swanitzer.
Chairman Chadwick, Ward. So maybe if I can answer a little bit, and let me first make sure the differentiation. So if I could read the statute, what violent felony is. So violent felony in our statute means murder, manslaughter, kidnapping, sexual assault in the 1st or 2nd degree, robbery, aggravated assault, strangulation of a household member, aircraft hijacking, arson in the 1st or 2nd degree, aggravated burglary, or a multiple domestic battery instance. So those are violent felonies that if you commit, you would never, under this bill or under our current law, get your voting rights back. Everything else would be considered non-violent felony. And we have had the discussion over the years of that bifurcation. Does third-degree sexual assault, should that be a violent felony? And that, that conversation certainly intertwines with this bill, certainly intertwines with other areas of our law. And so that's always a legislative prerogative. We are one of those weird states that has a kind of a differentiation of felony versus violent felony. And then second has this, I think we're one of 2 states left that actually has this bifurcation still in our statutes in regards to voting rights. So, most states have just said, hey, when you pay your time for your crime, we have liberty and justice for all. And so whatever that sentencing is, the judge imposes, once you fulfill that and you fulfill your obligations, our Constitution requires our prisons and our system to work on, rehabilitation to reenter society. So I guess the argument is, which crimes are so severe and which crimes aren't. That's historically where the legislature's drawn the line. So no, I agree. There's lots of nonviolent, serious felonies. Question is, when do you get your voting rights back? When have you paid your debt? And then as you can tell, 2 states say you've never paid your debt. You never get those back. So it is just a philosophical discussion among states on what we allow. My ultimate goal is to try to level the playing field so we don't get people caught in the trap.
Thank you, Chairman Zwanister. Follow up?
Mr. Vice Chairman and Chairman Swanitzer. So I'm talking about people who have committed a nonviolent felony while serving the public trust. I'm talking about elected officials. My question is, would you consider it a friendly amendment if we took that particular felony, those particular felonies, laundering, embezzlement, while you're working under the public's trust? If we exempted those?
Chairman Zwanister.
Chairman Chadwick, Representative Ward. So, philosophically, I could probably agree that there are some non-violent felonies that are so egregious that maybe people shouldn't have their voting rights back. At the same time, that would create a third class in our laws on voting rights. And so I would struggle with, we already have this interesting bifurcation that other states don't have. A trifurcation, I'm not sure that's a word or not, would be even more, I think, interesting philosophically and probably difficult for the department. When they're granting these restorations to go through, they would probably have an administrative burden to say, let's go check through more statutes. So in concept, no, but administratively and kind of philosophically on now a tripartite system, I think that would be difficult. It's probably the fair answer.
Any further questions? Representative Penn.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. Chairman, a bit ago, you mentioned that a person with 3 nonviolent felonies would still get their voting rights back. Is there anything in current statute or this that identifies or points out how many, or is it just any number? So if they've had 5, heaven forbid. I just wonder if if somebody's had multiple nonviolent felonies, that might demonstrate a lack of judgment and therefore someone who we may not want to have voting rights returned.
Chairman Zwanister.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Penn, no, I completely agree. So right now, the current state of the law is 1 nonviolent felony only, or in the related occurrence of events. So you were on drugs and you stole something at a low level. It's multiple nonviolent felonies, but it's the same occurrence. So is there a point where you have 6 or 7 nonviolent felonies over 10 years and philosophically, you probably shouldn't get your voting rights back? Yeah, I think I agree with that, honestly. The problem is administratively, then you're having the department and the department then has to notify all of your clerks, right? If you should be on the voter rolls or not, and they have to double check before you're allowed to register to vote. So there's a lot of other systems that come into play. You'll hear from the department and other people. And so just the administrative burden is the difficulty. And so philosophically, I think we all agree, some people are model citizens, they do something dumb in their youth, they should get those voting rights back. Maybe they do two dumb things. And then we all know there's people who do dumb things and have 20 years, and they probably shouldn't. The question is administratively, how do we make this work where people can easily transport into states and out of states and move here without understanding they have lost, if they've committed a violent felony somewhere else, or if they've done that in another state, where the department then has to make a decision, and you'll hear from the department, well, these are 5 and these are non-violent, but they seem bad. And somewhere you have to have that line in law, and it's really tough because every situation is different.
Thank you, Chairman Wannisser. Any further questions? Seeing none. Do we have any state agencies? I heard a couple of references. Please come forward.
Mr. Chairman, House Committee members, my name is Dan Shen. I'm the Director for the Department of Corrections. I just had a few comments with your permission on House Bill 263 and more especially the administrative operations thereof. In 2018, the department was charged with going back and reviewing the restoration of voting rights. And that was very specific to nonviolent first-time felons. And we keep records. We're mandated to keep records for 100 years. We have a very antiquated system and we have records electronically from 2010. So with that being said, we were charged in 2018 to go back to 2010. That's where the 2010 figure comes about. Beyond 2010 or prior, a person could apply through an application. With that being said, we completed that in 2018. It took 2 individuals 18 months to go through that process. And I would like to talk about that process just a little bit. You have to track these individuals down. It's required that we do a criminal history to make sure there's no other. We have to do backgrounds on them. Then we have to, at this point, we do criminal histories. We write to the Secretary of State and we restore the rights. We can average about 170 individuals per worker per month. Okay, and so it took us 18 months. We had 2 AWAC positions, then we abolished the positions. Since then, the Department of Corrections releases between 550 and 600 individuals a year. Approximately 2.5 times that come off of supervision through probation and parole. We take it upon ourselves to restore these voting rights. And with that being said, we pass the work around. So I'd like to talk about the difference of what House Bill 236 does. We now go from first-time felon, nonviolent felon to multiple felons. So, and number 2, it incorporates statute 106. It's 160-106, which restores the rights for elector or jurors. And also we have to confirm the payment of their supervision, their restitution and payment to courts. So what that would require, I made myself a few notes here. If we went back from 2010, the 2020 to December 31st, December 22, we would have to go back and search 14,200 records alone. And that's eliminating that we have restored 3,400 voting rights to individuals. So that's eliminating those 3,400 plus violent felonies. So with that being said, I'll follow the direction of the policymakers, but it's going to, without the help, it would take years to accomplish this. So, Mr. Chairman, I stand for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Shannon. Questions, committee, Representative Penn.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. So to confirm, are you in support or in opposition to this bill?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Penn, respectfully, the Department of Corrections doesn't incarcerate. We don't release. I don't believe that rights should be subjective. We'll follow the law. What I'm not in support of, what I'm advising the committee is, if it's the anticipation that it's an automatic restoration, We have 1,023 funded positions in the Department of Corrections. We have 216 vacancies at this time. I would not be able, if this bill would pass, I would not be able to complete it without assistance. I hope that answered your question.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Shannon. Anyone else? Representative Hornock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So what do you do now? Do you, in statute, you do have to kind of issue a certificate? Could you just explain what you do now with that process?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Hornock, at this time, we're up to date as far as the electronic. So anyone that's released, we have to go and review if it's, first of all, first time felon conviction. Does it meet the nonviolent statute? And at that point, they qualify for restoration of voting rights. And then we notify the Secretary of State. If an individual is prior to 2010 would meet this criteria, they can file an application. We receive about 5 to 6 a month. But I would anticipate when individuals are told that it's automatic with multiple felonies, as well as restores the rights to be elector or juror, that I would anticipate we'd have a flood of applications. I would think so. So at this time, so we're looking at, you're looking at approximately 65 to 70 applications prior to 2010 that we address. And we're doing approximately 1,800 moving forward. That would be probation and parole as well as release from incarceration.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Shannon. Representative Klauston.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Just to be, just to get the answer, the assistance you're saying to complete this, that would be the 21 positions. What do you think you would need for assistance if this went into law?
Okay. Mr. Chairman, Representative Klauston, I'm not one for growing state government, and the positions, the fiscal note that I submitted it was a blanket that we would review everyone back to 100 years. And I thought if you wanted that done in 2-year time, this is what we would take. The department did not was not asked to submit a fiscal note on this House Bill 263. I can tell you, if we just go back to 2010, as I mentioned, we're looking at 14,269 records. That's not counting applications. One person can do, it takes about an hour to do an application. We can do 170 per month. So depending on what the direction that we were provided, we can do roughly around anecdotally 230, 225 per person per year. And just to go back to what we have electronic records would take us quite some time. It took 2 individuals 18 months to do those 14,000 records.
Thank you, Mr. Shannon. Any further questions? Representative Ward.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. You mentioned vacancies. Have you now, or have you ever had in the past a vaccine mandate?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Ward, Department of Corrections never had a vaccine mandate. Matter of fact, if I may, Representative, in 2022, our retention rate has increased. We still have those vacancies. We just don't have the applications, but our retention rate, people are staying at Department of Corrections. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Shannon. Any other questions? If not, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And do we have any, please come forward.
Thank you, committee, and Mr. Vice Chairman, Marguerite Herman, Legal for Min Voters. And I'm here to speak in favor of the bill. I remember when the original bill several years ago to make the restoration automatic, but back to 2010, only one felony, et cetera, as the chairman mentioned. And I remember the testimony of the head of the Department of Corrections at that time, Bob Lampert, who had extensive experience in the Department of Corrections in Texas for several years, and then here for decades. So he was speaking from a lot of experience in the business, recognized as really one of the best in the country, and he supported restoration of rights And I remember he testified that this was an important piece of reintegrating people back into their community once they were released. And again, having discharged all the part of their sentences, having repaid their debt, that there's that phrase, repaying their debt. And, you know, what I think, what we all hope is that when people are released from prison, you know, rehabilitated or not, that they reconnect with their families, they get invested in their communities. And he said there was a definite impact on recidivism or lack of recidivism. Reoffending, he thought, went down because people had a stake in their family, and voting was a real important piece of that. As we all know, it makes us really engaged with the government, citizens, and everything going on around you. So he spoke, he supported this very strongly. And I took that to heart, and I also repeat his words today, that this is really a piece of making our communities solid. And I remember just one more memory from that time, that there was someone representing law enforcement, and he was afraid that these restorations would swamp all the voting registrations and do away with our, you know, criminal code. I mean, he was very afraid, and of course that has not happened. You know, this is 20 years on, and so I think so. Those two comments I just want to repeat, and I'm very sympathetic with the administrative load of this. But I will say, you will have to do only once. Once you go back and to all the people who have been incarcerated since whenever, and I would wonder that if it's a nonviolent felony, how many long term, how many people who were sentenced 60 years ago are still in prison for those things. So, but you know, I certainly trust the DOC figures. If that's what they say it'll take, I have complete confidence in that. But I would just say that you just have to do this once, and then you're caught up, and then you're going forward with this. So that is sort of a mitigation, a little bit of that cost. But anyway, I would say, again, League of Women Voters, we certainly want to remove all barriers to voting that do not produce any value. So it's sort of whatever barriers are put up, they should have a concomitant value to make elections more secure, fair, open, et cetera. And I think removing this does no harm. In fact, does a lot of good for Wyoming. And once again, repeating the fact that this consistency traveling to other states, it makes it more to be applied and correctly when people move to other states. I will say that there is some that confusion on the state by state basis. I know the county clerk here, people will thinking that their votes are restored back in where their home state, and they'll move to Wyoming and mistakenly try to register. And as we all know, we have a very secure registration system. And so the clerks will do a search of the records and will say, no, you can't. So those people are caught and informed they cannot register. So I assume that happens when people move on to other states as well. Anyway, I speak in favor of the bill. I think it does take care of some inconsistencies. And I will just say, as to the effect of poor judgment, I would say people who commit misdemeanors can display some poor judgment. But I do understand the caution. Anyway, we stand in support of this bill. We think it's good for people, it's good for families, it's good for if we have fewer recidivists, I think that's good for everyone as well. I'll stand for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Furman. Questions? Seeing none. Mr. Shannon, second turn.
Mr. Chairman, committee members, once again, I'm Dan Shannon. I just wanted to make a brief comment. The current statute does allow for those prior to 2010 to apply. They can apply through an application. So it's not that they're restricted for having their voting rights restored. And you just recently heard testimony. It is true that it assists with the reduction of recidivism rates when individuals who are released are returned to our community and being active in our community. It does lower recidivism rates, a rate of return to prison. And I bring that with you from 37 years of corrections in two states. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I stand for questions.
Thank you. Questions, further questions? Thank you. Okay, any other agencies? I see our Secretary of State coming forward, Mr. Gray.
Thank you, Vice Chairman Chadwick. I'm Chuck Gray, the Wyoming Secretary of State. This is a policy choice. And as was mentioned earlier by Director Shannon, there is that application process for the situation before any convictions prior to 2010. And, one thing listening to the testimony that I wanted to clarify a little bit, I've talked with the clerks about the voter registration form. It needs some clarity to make clear that if your voting rights have been restored in another state, it doesn't mean that it's restored in the state of Wyoming. And I want to ensure to you that we're going to work on that on the form and also work with the clerks to make sure that there are some uniform procedures to notify individuals that just because their voting rights have been restored in another state, that does not mean they have been restored in the state of Wyoming. So just want to clarify that. I think that, the notion of when you're making this policy choice, the notion of uniformity, just for the sake of clarity, I think we're going to try to work on that. And, I'm not sure it should really enter your thought process as much. That's just my opinion, because there is a responsibility to understand that. We're going to work on having that clarity. The other thing I'd say is that I am concerned about multiple, nonviolent offenses being open to a restoration, and we'd want to get any policy change correct. So one thing is, this bill got scheduled in half a day, maybe in the interim, that is a possibility, us looking at this a little more and having a list of every single offense and whether the bill that is constructed allows a restoration or not. But obviously this is a very important issue and it is a policy choice. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Any questions? Representative Klausner.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Mr. Secretary, just kind of what I'm hearing and looking at is maybe there's some administrative fixes we could look at in the next few months. I think it's important, somebody 20 years old does embezzlement and right, they can't vote for life and they've done their time. And so I think they need to get their voting rights back. My figures here would need 8 people for a year to do this project right now, as written for the Department of Corrections, and they really don't have enough staff. Do you see some administrative fixes that you could bring to us to help improve our process?
Mr. Vice Chairman, Representative Klauston certainly would work with the Department of Corrections and our office with the WyoReg system. We had a memo. This bill was filed after the fiscal note request, so it didn't come through our office. We had a memo from the 2017 bill that, I was reviewing about the WyoReg interaction. It really, though, does come to the Department of Corrections, notifying the clerks and or the Secretary of State's office. So I'm happy to communicate with the Department of Corrections on how to work on that issue. On the form front, one of the first things I talked with the Laramie County Clerk was actually the situation that Representative Zwanitzer talked about, which is there were a couple individuals that registered that were not eligible, and then said, "Look, I was coming from another state. This is a misunderstanding." And I looked at the voter registration form. It has no statement about this issue that if you're restored in another state and you come here that you're not necessarily restored. We need to put that there, and the form is pretty packed in, but we're going to make it relatively prominent, and that is a form produced by the Secretary of State's office. Now, I'd like to engage with the clerks on some uniform procedures on this issue for those that are registering to vote in person that aren't filling out the form. I think some of that is already happening. The clerks do a great job, but I will say that just in the first 2 weeks in office before this bill was even filed, that did have a couple comments on this issue, and I want to address some of the concerns from the last cycle regarding misunderstandings of voter right restoration.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Any other questions? Representative Hornoff?
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. So, Mr. Secretary of State, we have a system in place. Are you currently, do you feel like that system's working, the process? So we've heard that this bill would, create a lot of difficulty with getting this bill in place. Is there any concern you have with the current way that we're doing things, regardless of who the person is, what the offense is, that kind of thing? How's it working so far?
Mr. Secretary.
Well, Mr. Vice Chairman, I was here in 2017. It was my first session when the original bill was passed. Aside from that, I think the debates, not the original bill, but that update that Representative Chairman Zwanitzer was talking about, I can't recall much from 2018 to 2022. And then I've been here 30 days in office. I can tell you, I know attorneys that have done that application process to restore voter rights for felonies before 2010. I believe it usually takes an attorney, which maybe it's a deterrent, I suppose. But there is a process there. And I just want to make sure when you make this policy choice that you have all that information in front of you. And I don't think the process is broken, but there are some things there that would have to be crossed. I don't think it's broken in any way, and I know attorneys that have done that process.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Any further questions? Seeing none? Thank you. Any other agencies, organizations, associations?
Good morning. Good morning. My name is Antonio Serrano. I'm the Advocacy Director for the ACLU of Wyoming. The ACLU is here today in enthusiastic support of HB 263. Currently, millions of American citizens can now vote as a result of a felony conviction. In recent years, like we heard mentioned earlier, there's been a great deal of legislative activity around the nation concerning disenfranchisement policies, and we are happy that our state is trying to take a step in the right direction. In many communities in Wyoming, in many communities, Wyoming's laws have created a situation that makes voting difficult and honestly can be scary at times for folks. Plain and simple, felony disenfranchisement laws have a serious and disproportionate effect on the voting power of low-income families and communities of color like the people who live in my neighborhood in South Cheyenne. These are people who deserve to have their voice heard through their vote. The disparities formerly incarcerated people face is worth paying attention to because they are Wyomingites too. Currently, BIPOC people are overrepresented in the prisons, with Black and Indigenous people feeling it the hardest. We know that voting plays an important role in helping individuals with felony convictions return to society. After someone serves their time, they deserve a shot at rebuilding their life, and I believe that this bill can help. Studies have shown that when individuals with a felony conviction participate in the democratic process, they have a lower rate of subsequent arrest, making it possible for them to not go back, which is what we all kind of want. By giving people the basic right to vote, we are empowering them to have the stronger stake in their community and making it easier for them to successfully return to society. Formerly incarcerated people have done their time, they've paid their debt, and we urge you to give them a chance at being part of Wyoming again. So we ask you to vote yes on this bill. Thank you for your time, and I stand for any questions.
Thank you. Any questions? Seeing none? Thank you. Any other organizations, associations? Seeing none, we'll go on to public comment. Do we have anybody present who would like to speak on this issue? I'm sorry. Okay. When you're ready.
Mr. Chairman.
We can hear you.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I apologize. My camera does not work, so I apologize. My face is not on there. My name is Julie Fries. I'm the Fremont County Clerk and also speaking for the County Clerks Association this morning. We take no position on this. As you know, we don't look at policy issues. We look at as if we can administer it, which we do like the fact that would be automatically restored in the system, so that would go through wire reg. That's a good thing for us. What I do want to talk about a little bit is just the way that it actually works for the out of state at this time. So currently, when we are at the polls, most of us at the polls don't have access to our DCI records. On the DCI records are the state felonies and the federal. So those are the only two that we get. So when you're filling out a registration form, you have to be truthful on there. And the part that we need to fix on there, it's just not very well written the way we have it, and we want to change it. We have gotten a lot better. It's the very beginning of our voter registration form, and it asks if you're 18, a US citizen, and if you're a felon, and if you are a felon, have your rights been restored? And that is a total internal thing that we can fix. Those of us who are working with the state e-poll book system, we do have access on election day to make sure that these people that are felons and not supposed to be voting in the state and federally are caught at that point right there. We can also give them, if they deny that, we can give them a provisional ballot, and we can continue that way. What we don't get, and we aren't going to get for a very long time, is out-of-state felons. They have to be truthful. And so I know Carbon County had a number of out-of-state felons that we struggled with at the polls who actually told us that. Again, we can have them vote provisional until we have them figure out if their rights have been restored. But I just wanted you to know that that's how that works. The out-of-state felons might fall through the cracks, and they will say that. They'll say, well, I was restored in our state, and if they aren't restored here, and I see it looks like in the bill that they would not just write a letter, but they would, and maybe it's an easier process. I don't think it's super easy right now, but again, they're not going to be able to do it on election day. And more than anything, I just wanted to tell you the process and see if I can answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Reese. Any questions? Seeing none, we'll move on to the sponsor. Further comment?
Just quickly, two things, Mr. Chairman, that I didn't mention. One, when you get your voting rights restored, I think you all know this, but you also get the right to serve on a jury. And so that's been kind of the uneasy feeling historically in the legislature, right? But you can see 42 states, no matter if it's a violent or non-violent felony, they allow you either as soon as you're out of incarceration or you paid your associated fines and fees to be able to vote again. I don't know if the legislature is ready for that, but if that was your prerogative committee, you could certainly just say, we're doing that. I did want, and maybe it's a clarification, I appreciate Director Shannon because he follows the law. And the law in this bill, as it says, they shall issue those certificates according to Section F. F basically is this catch-all that if you go vote and you have nonviolent felonies and you weren't aware of what our voting rights were, it's kind of deemed you're not going to be charged with a crime for doing that. And so while I completely read it how Director Shannon does it, he and his department should be going back and finding all these. We don't give him any resources to do that. He'll just be doing what he's been doing. And this section is kind of the catch-all for anybody who I think gets caught in that trap, who's a nonviolent felon. So we could certainly put a position and money towards the department going back and doing this if the committee's pleasure is to do that. But I hate to say we are going to be a little bit on the loose with the law of, yes, he shall be doing this, but as long as he keeps doing what he's doing, and anybody who comes forward or gets caught in this kind of trap that I call it from other states, we just consider them deemed restored. So that's maybe the difference of opinion or the weirdness of this law would be, yes, you're supposed to be doing this, but we know you can't. So if it happens, it's cleared. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you. Further questions for Chairman Zwanitzer? Seeing none? And we still have no one else online? Okay. What's the pleasure of the committee? We have a motion. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
And a second. Marilyn, would you please call the roll call?
Yes. Representative Chadwick. Representative Klauston,
No.
Representative Hornock,
No.
Representative O'Hearn,
Aye.
Representative Penn,
No.
Representative Trujillo,
Aye.
Representative Ward,
No.
Representative Yin, absentee vote of aye. Chairman Zwaniter. The vote passes, or the bill passes with 5 ayes, 4 noes.
City, I'll pledge to you, I will do some cleanup work on the bill if it actually gets some legs. Otherwise, it's only hope for an interim, longer conversation and talk. With that committee, anyone else here to testify or any public comment? All right, welcome to the second day of reading of the budget. This is your first time. Pace yourselves. It's a marathon, not a sprint.